Arkhangelsk in the heart of winter was not a place for the weak. The snow came down endlessly, covering the forests and villages in a thick white silence that seemed eternal. The river lay frozen solid, the trees bowed under the weight of ice, and the sky was a low gray ceiling pressing down upon the land. In this remote wilderness, far from the bustle of the cities, lived Viktor Sokolov, a man who had seen more wars than he cared to remember. He was a veteran of the Soviet-Afghan conflict, a soldier once feared and respected, now reduced to the life of a solitary figure in a half-forgotten cabin at the edge of the forest. His days passed quietly, marked by the rhythm of chopping firewood, boiling thin soup, and staring into the fire as if searching for memories that refused to fade. His only companion was the silence, and sometimes the silence was heavier than war itself. That evening, the storm had come quickly. The wind howled through the cracks of the old wooden cabin, rattling the shutters, and forcing Viktor to pile logs higher into the stove. He wrapped himself in his coat, the same one he had carried since his service, frayed and patched but still intact, like the man who wore it. Outside, the snow whipped against the earth like artillery fire. Viktor listened to the roar of the blizzard and felt, as he often did, that the world beyond his four walls had forgotten him entirely. The war had taken his comrades, time had taken his family, and the years had taken his youth. He thought himself the last survivor of everything that once mattered. Then, through the howling of the storm, came a sound that froze him in place. At first he thought it was just the wind bending strangely through the trees, but no, the sound was different. It was the long, drawn-out howl of wolves. He set his pipe aside and sat straighter, listening. The howl came again, this time weaker, fractured, as if torn apart by pain. It was not the cry of predators calling their pack. It was the sound of wounded creatures lost in the storm. Viktor's soldier's instincts stirred. He had heard such voices before, not from wolves, but from men, injured comrades calling out in the chaos of battle. For a long moment he remained still, torn between reason and instinct. Reason told him to stay inside, for wolves were not allies of men, especially in winter. But instinct pushed him to stand, to reach for his lantern, and step out into the snow. The storm bit into him as soon as he opened the door. The icy wind clawed at his face and made his breath burn. Snow crunched under his boots, already knee-deep in some places, but he pressed forward, guided only by the faint cries. His lantern's glow flickered against the endless white, casting weak light against the shadows of trees. Each gust threatened to extinguish it, but he shielded the flame with a soldier's determination. He moved slowly, methodically, just as he had once moved through enemy terrain. The howls grew louder, closer, pulling him deeper into the forest where the snow lay untouched. At last he saw them. 5 shapes half buried in snow, scattered as if they had collapsed in their tracks. They were wolves, large and powerful once, now reduced to trembling skeletons covered in frost. Their fur was matted with blood and ice, their paws caught in steel traps left by hunters. One raised its head weakly, amber eyes meeting Viktor's with no aggression, only exhaustion. Another whimpered, too weak to even bare its teeth. Viktor stopped, his heart heavy. Here were creatures everyone called enemies of man, but in their suffering, he saw not beasts, but brothers in pain. He knelt in the snow, his lantern casting light over their wounds. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the first trap, his stiff fingers prying open the rusted jaws of metal. The wolf flinched but did not bite. Instead, it watched him, breathing heavily, as he freed its paw. Viktor spoke in a low voice, the same tone he had once used to calm terrified young soldiers. "Easy now, Tovarish, easy." He moved from one to the next, dismantling the cruel iron that held them. Each time, the wolves tensed, but none struck at him. By the time he freed the last one, his hands were numb, his coat soaked in snow, but his eyes burned with the strange fire of purpose. The wolves did not run. Too weak to leave, they limped slowly behind him as he turned back toward his cabin. He walked ahead, lantern swaying, and when he looked over his shoulder, the sight nearly stopped his breath. 5 wounded wolves trailing silently in his footsteps, leaving a line of prints in the snow behind him. Man and beast, enemies by nature, drawn together by survival. That night, in a cabin lit by fire and shadow, Viktor and the wolves shared the same roof. He gave them scraps of food, whatever he had, and tended their wounds as best he could. The storm raged on outside, shaking the earth, but inside, an unlikely truce was born. Victor sat by the fire, his rifle within reach, yet unused, while the wolves lay in silence, their eyes reflecting the flames. For the first time in many years, the lonely veteran did not feel entirely alone. When dawn broke, the storm had eased, though the world outside was still a vast ocean of white. Victor woke to the sound of breathing, not his own, but the low rasp of the wolves resting in the corners of his cabin. For a moment he thought it had been a dream, that he had only imagined dragging 5 wild creatures out of the jaws of death. But when he pushed himself up from his bed and looked around, he saw them clearly, 5 wolves lying on his floor, their fur steaming from the heat of the stove, their ribs rising and falling in the rhythm of fragile sleep. Their bodies were a map of wounds and scars, torn flesh where the traps had bit into them, patches of fur missing, and eyes dulled by hunger. He should have been afraid, perhaps, but instead he felt the same quiet responsibility he had once felt for young soldiers who had looked to him for guidance on battlefields long gone. He stoked the fire until the cabin grew warm and then, with slow steps, began tending to his unlikely guests. He boiled water in a dented pot, cut strips of cloth from one of his old shirts, and cleaned their wounds carefully, murmuring soft words as he worked. The wolves stirred, their ears twitching, their eyes occasionally flicking to him with suspicion. Yet none of them lunged or snapped. They seemed to understand, at least in part, that this human was not there to harm them. The largest of them, a silver-furred wolf with a scar slashing across its muzzle, watched him with sharp intelligence, never sleeping fully, always following his movements. Victor found himself nodding to it, as though acknowledging the presence of another commander. Food was a harder matter. Victor had little for himself. Some dried bread, a small jar of pickled cabbage, and a few strips of salted fish he had been saving. His stomach tightened at the thought of sharing it, but he did not hesitate. He softened the fish in boiling water and divided it among the wolves, setting the pieces on a wooden board and stepping back. At first they did not move, only eyed the food warily, their instincts telling them this could be a trick. But hunger overruled caution. One by one they crawled forward, snatching the morsels, swallowing them whole, then retreating to the corners. Victor watched silently, thinking how much they resembled starving soldiers devouring rations after days of fighting. When the food was gone, the cabin returned to silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the deep breathing of his companions. Through the day he spoke to them, not expecting them to understand but needing to fill the silence. He told them about Afghanistan, about the heat and dust so different from the snow outside. He told them of men he had fought beside, and men he had lost, their names slipping from his lips like prayers. He told them about the loneliness of returning to a homeland that felt less like home than the war zone had been. The wolves did not answer, of course, but their eyes never left him, and in that steady gaze he found something that felt very close to understanding. When night returned, the storm rose again, though not as fierce as before. Victor sat by the window, watching snow sweep across the trees, and felt the strange weight of what he had done. In saving these wolves, he had crossed an invisible line. No villager would forgive him if they knew. Wolves were killers, they would say, enemies of livestock, enemies of man. Yet when he looked back at the 5 figures stretched out on his floor, he saw no killers. He saw wounded survivors, not unlike himself, who had been beaten by the world but had not given up. Something about that reflection comforted him. Later, as he prepared for sleep, the silver wolf rose and limped across the cabin. Victor froze, his hand brushing the stock of his rifle, but the wolf did not attack. Instead, it lowered itself onto the floor only a few feet away, laying its head on its paws, eyes still open. Victor stared back, feeling the firelight flicker between them, and in that moment, a pact was silently formed. Neither would harm the other. Both understood the fragility of life in the cold wilderness. As Victor drifted into uneasy rest, he realized he no longer heard only the wind outside. He heard the breathing of 5 wolves, steady and close, as if the loneliness that had haunted him for years had been pushed back by their presence. For the first time in a long time, he felt that perhaps he had not been forgotten by the world after all. The days that followed unfolded slowly, each one a battle against the cold and hunger, yet filled with a strange sense of purpose that Victor had not felt in years. Every morning, He woke to the sound of the wolves stirring on his wooden floor, their bodies rising and falling in quiet rhythm, their breath misting in the frigid air. At first he thought they would slip away once they regained some strength, vanishing back into the wilderness, but they stayed. Too weak to hunt, too wounded to travel far, they lingered in his care, bound to him not by chains or force, but by necessity and a fragile trust. Victor did what he could with what little he had. He boiled fish from the frozen river, hacking through the ice with his axe and lowering his line into the black water until it yielded a few glimmering bodies. He caught rabbits with snares, though he always gave more to the wolves than to himself. His own meals grew smaller, thinner, but he did not complain. Something inside him told him that keeping these animals alive was worth more than filling his belly. He patched their wounds with torn fabric and ointments left from his days as a soldier, hands steady as if he were still working in a field hospital under fire. Each scar he cleaned reminded him of his comrades, of blood spilled on foreign soil, of pain endured in silence. The wolves learned to accept his presence. The smallest of them, a young dark-furred one with a limp, grew bold first, edging closer when he set down food, sniffing his hands, even brushing against his boots. The others followed more slowly, always cautious, but gradually lowering the wall of suspicion. The silver wolf, the scarred leader, remained watchful, its golden eyes never left Victor, and yet in that gaze there was no longer only suspicion, there was respect. Victor recognized the look. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who acknowledged a commander who had earned their trust. At night, when the wind shrieked outside and the fire burned low, Victor would talk. He spoke not because he expected them to understand, but because silence had been his only company for too long. He told them of the deserts of Afghanistan, of the heat that had burned his skin, of the mountains where ambushes waited in every shadow. He told them of the friends he had lost, young men whose laughter still haunted him, men buried in lands far from their mothers. Sometimes his voice cracked, but he continued, and the wolves listened, their heads tilted, their eyes fixed on him as though they could sense the weight of his grief. He began to feel that in sharing these words aloud, even to creatures who could not answer, he was lightening a burden he had carried alone for decades. As days turned to weeks, the wolves grew stronger. Their fur regained its sheen, their wounds closed, and their ribs no longer jutted as sharply beneath their coats. They began to move with more confidence inside the cabin, sometimes circling near the fire, sometimes slipping outside into the snow for short periods before returning. Victor worried that once they were fully healed, they would vanish into the forest and he would be left alone again, his brief company only a memory. But each evening, no matter where they roamed, they returned to his cabin. It was as though they had accepted him into their pack, just as he had accepted them into his home. One evening, Victor sat sharpening his old knife by the fire when the silver wolf approached him. He tensed, waiting, but the wolf simply sat a few feet away, its eyes locked with his. For long minutes, man and beast regarded one another in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. Victor thought of the many nights he had stared into the eyes of fellow soldiers, exchanging unspoken words before a battle. And now, in this frozen wilderness, he felt the same bond with this scarred creature. Both were leaders scarred by struggle, both were survivors carrying the weight of those they had lost. He whispered quietly, "We are the same, you and I." From then on, he no longer thought of them as beasts. They were his brothers in exile, comrades drawn together by suffering. And with every passing day, Victor felt the loneliness that had gnawed at him for years slowly receding, replaced by the warmth of their presence. In their company, he discovered something he had long thought buried, the ability to heal, not just others, but himself. The quiet days with the wolves could not last forever. Victor knew this deep down, just as every soldier knows that peace is only the pause between battles. The forest whispered its warnings, the distant echo of footsteps in the snow, the faint crack of branches where none should have broken. The wolves sensed it too. Their ears pricked at night, their bodies tense as they sniffed the air beyond the cabin. They had grown stronger under Victor's care, their wounds mostly healed, but they still moved with caution, as if expecting danger to appear from the trees. It came one cold morning when the frost glittered on the windows like shards of glass. Victor had just returned from the river with a small catch of fish when he saw the first tracks, men's boots, heavy and fresh, leading toward the cabin. His heart sank. Villagers, hunters. They had followed the trail of wolves, and now they were close. He glanced back at the cabin, where the silver wolf stood in the doorway, its yellow eyes fixed on him, its body rigid. The others moved restlessly inside, sensing the same threat. Soon the figures appeared, dark shapes against the endless snow. There were 4 of them, rifles slung over their shoulders, fur hats pulled low against the cold. As they drew nearer, Victor could see the determination in their faces. These were not men out for a casual hunt, they had come with a purpose. One of them called out, his voice sharp in the frozen air. "Old man, we know the wolves are here. Step aside, they've haunted our herds long enough." Victor set down his basket of fish and stood tall, though the years had bent his back. He wore his old military coat, the metal still pinned to its breast from a time when men had saluted him. He placed himself firmly between the hunters and the cabin, his boots planted in the snow. "These wolves are wounded," he said evenly. "They are no threat to you now. Leave them." The hunters laughed, though uneasily. "Wolves never stop being wolves," one spat. "When they're strong again, they'll kill. Better we end it now." They shifted their rifles into their hands, eyes darting to the shadows behind Victor where they knew the beasts waited. A long silence stretched. The wolves moved out from the cabin, one by one, forming a half-circle behind their human guardian. Their breaths steamed in the air, their eyes glowing faintly in the pale sun. The hunters raised their rifles higher, fingers tightening on the triggers. Victor's heart pounded, but he did not move aside. Slowly, he lifted his chin, his voice steady with the weight of command that had never left him. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me. I've buried enough men in my life. I won't see these creatures join them." The men hesitated. For a moment they saw not a broken old soldier but the commander he had once been, the man who had survived wars they had only heard stories of. Then something even stranger happened. The silver wolf stepped forward and stood beside Victor, its body tall and proud, its scarred muzzle lifted. It did not growl or bare its teeth. It simply stood, shoulder to shoulder with the veteran, as though declaring allegiance. The other wolves followed, forming a silent line behind them. The hunters faltered. Their rifles wavered. Never had they seen such a sight. Wild wolves standing in disciplined stillness, not as predators, but as comrades united with a man. The snow around them seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the low whistle of the wind across the frozen fields. One hunter cursed under his breath and lowered his rifle. "This is madness," he muttered. "Maybe the old man's bewitched them." Another shifted uneasily and spat into the snow. "Let him keep them. If they cause trouble, it'll be his blood, not ours." Reluctantly, the others followed, stepping back, their boots crunching in the snow. They cast one last wary glance at Victor and his wolves before turning toward the forest. Their voices faded into the distance until only silence remained. Victor did not move until they were gone. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His knees trembled with the weight of the moment, but the silver wolf pressed close to his side, steady and sure. He reached down without thinking, his gloved hand brushing the thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice rough. "You stood with me." That night, as the fire burned low and the pack lay curled near the stove, Victor sat awake, staring at the flames. He knew the hunters would spread the story of what they had seen. Some would call him mad. Others would say it was a miracle. He did not care. For the first time in decades, he had stood for something more than his own survival. In the eyes of those wolves, and in their unspoken loyalty, he had found a reason to fight again. The hunters never returned, but their presence lingered in Victor's mind like a shadow. Word traveled fast through the small villages of Arkhangelsk, carried by hushed voices around stoves and in snowbound taverns. The lonely veteran had tamed 5 wolves, and they stood with him as if he were one of their own. Some scoffed, saying it was a tale spun by frightened men. Others crossed themselves and whispered of curses or miracles. For Victor, none of that mattered. He did not care for the opinions of villagers who had long forgotten him. What mattered were the wolves, who now walked beside him as though bound by fate. As the days lengthened and the storms softened into lighter flurries, Victor found himself venturing farther from the cabin, not alone but surrounded by the pack. They followed him to the river when he went to cut holes in the ice for fishing, their paws silent on the snow. They prowled the tree line when he set his traps, watching with sharp eyes. And when he walked the narrow trails between birch and pine, the wolves flanked him like loyal sentries. The loneliness that had once pressed on him like the weight of the frozen sky had lifted. Where once he had spoken to silence, now he spoke to his pack. He gave them names: Shadow, Ash, Frost, Ember, and Silver for the scarred leader. He spoke their names as if baptizing them into his family. Nights in the cabin changed too. The silence no longer felt like a void. Instead, it was filled with the sound of breathing, the occasional thump of a tail against the floor, the soft shifting of fur as the wolves settled near the stove. Victor would sit in his chair, pipe between his teeth, and watch the firelight flicker in their eyes. He told them stories of his youth, of battles fought and loves lost, of songs sung by campfires long extinguished. Perhaps they understood nothing, yet the way they watched him made him believe that, at the very least, they understood him. The forest seemed to recognize the bond as well. One bitter night, as a snowstorm swept in without warning, Victor heard cries carried by the wind. Not the howls of wolves, but the desperate shouts of men. Without hesitation, he pulled on his heavy coat and shouldered his lantern. The wolves gathered at his side, restless but ready. Together, they pushed into the storm. The snow lashed against them, blinding, suffocating, but the wolves forged a path, their keen senses guiding Victor through the white chaos. They found them at last. Two travelers, half buried in the snow, faces pale, bodies trembling with cold. Their sled had broken, their horse lost. They were minutes away from death. Victor dropped to his knees, brushing snow from their frozen faces, while the wolves circled, their bodies forming a living barrier against the wind. The men were too weak to protest when Victor hauled them to their feet and half-dragged them toward the cabin, the pack pressing close, shepherding the humans through the storm. By the time they reached shelter, the travelers collapsed near the fire, their lips trembling prayers of thanks. Their wide eyes darted to the wolves, but the beasts did not menace them. They simply lay in a protective ring, watching, guarding. For those men, it was not Victor alone who had saved them, but man and wolves together. In the days after, the story spread beyond Arkhangelsk. No longer was it just the rumor of hunters. Now there were witnesses who spoke of the old soldier who had led 5 wolves through a storm to rescue lives. Some called it divine intervention. Others called it madness. But a few whispered that perhaps in the frozen north, where man and beast alike struggled for survival, miracles could be born. For Victor, it was no miracle. It was simply life renewed. Each day he woke to the sound of his pack and felt a strength in his chest that had been gone for decades. He was no longer a forgotten veteran fading into the snow. He was a guardian of the forest, a companion to the wild, a man who had found family in the unlikeliest of places. When he stood at the edge of the woods, snow drifting around him, with Silver at his side and the others fanning out like shadows, Victor felt whole again. The wilderness was still merciless, the winters still long, but he no longer faced them alone. In the heart of Arkhangelsk, where the world seemed nothing but ice and silence, a lonely veteran and 5 wounded wolves had created something rare, something fragile, and something powerful. A bond that defied fear, defied nature, and stood as proof that even in the coldest snows, warmth could be found.